So I'm going to talk about the one bad thing about BDD. I'm kind of going to have to assume that you all know at least a little bit about BDD. But if you don't, it stands for Behaviour Driven Development. And I'm going to summarize it like that. It's to write executable specs that your customers can accept. So one of the very early articles about BDD, that was about 8 years ago, it had some guidelines for writing structured specs. It looked like this. This is actually out of that article. So the structure is as a, I want, so that, and then given, when, then. And that given, when, then is repeated over and over again. And this seemed like quite a good idea. So people started writing tools that actually let you write specs like this and have the computer understand them. This kind of spec turned into a language. This language is called Gherkin. And Gherkin is now quite a big thing. It's been translated into over 60 languages. Here's a Norwegian bit of spec. And Gherkin builds itself as a business readable language. But the problem I've got with Gherkin is, although it uses the sorts of words that businesses use, it's not actually all that readable. I mean, it's kind of got the sorts of words that businesses use in there, but it starts to look a little bit like code. Particularly, I mean, this is a kind of tutorial level example, but when you've got thousands and thousands of these specs, it definitely starts to feel a lot more like code. And the trouble is, because it's written in English, people don't like to admit that they don't really understand this. It's like if you've ever read like a formal spec. Here's some HTTP spec, for instance. It looks like English, this, but when you actually try and sit there and understand what's going on, it just makes you feel stupid. And making your customers feel stupid is not a great idea. And there's another example of this sort of thing, contracts. Contracts also, they look like English, but they're not really English. And there's a kind of close correlation between specs and contracts. You can end up with a spec being a contract, and you can end up negotiating over your spec. And that's a bad place to be, because Agile, remember, one of the things in the Agile Manifesto is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So what else could you do? Well, you could not use Gherkin, you could just write code. So here's some code. It's still doing BDD. This is just kind of raw RSpec code. And it's still using the words that businesses use. So it's using orders and line items and money and that sort of thing. So you get quite a lot of the advantages of BDD by writing your specs like this. It's at the right level. So if you need to change the way that your system's put together, this kind of thing is still going to be valuable. It's not like a very low-level unit test where you basically have to throw it away if you're going to do a big restructure of your system. But the trouble with this is it's no longer customer-facing. You can't show your customer this. So you end up having to write something that does go to the customer, and then you write something like this, and the two, well, you're supposed to keep them in sync, but you know, no one ever really keeps them in sync. So that's repeating yourself. So you've got to do something else, really. And coming back to that idea, contract negotiation versus customer collaboration, well, what does customer collaboration look like? Well, let's think about that a bit. Sometimes it's text, sometimes it's words on a page like this. And for that, this given, when, then idea, that works quite well. But as I said, when you've got lots of these, you kind of want to know what the differences are. So you want to start showing, well, there's a lot of boilerplate here, there's a lot of words that are the same, and it's only really the differences that matter between these two. But then you might want tables, right? Maybe a better way of collaborating with your customer is to start writing things down in a table. Not all of your spec, but you know, bits of your spec would fit better into a table, perhaps. But then there's other things that you can collaborate with your customer on. So they might have reports. I've no idea what this report is, I just dragged it off Google Images, but this looks like the sort of report some customers have. And although this looks like nonsense to me, to the customer, this sort of thing is really easy for them to read. They know what to look at, they know what to pick out from this kind of report, because they look at it every day. So you can use that, rather than forcing them to read your spec, you can start to write your spec using this kind of idea, and you can collaborate better on that. You can use their familiarity with this sort of thing. Where we were, we actually had an even worse state than this. We had diagrams, right? We ended up with this kind of stuff coming from the customer. And, okay, I drew this, but it was this kind of idea was coming from the customer. And what we were doing, we were looking at a bit of code that worked out for train drivers what happens when they arrive at a station and they have to decouple their train or they have to couple it to something else. And it gets really complicated because these are times here, these numbers here, and you've got 5 minutes gap there, so 2 minutes and 3 minutes, and you've got 6 minutes there. But what happens if that goes down to 5 minutes? And then what happens if that goes down to 4 minutes because that's got bigger? So there's lots of variations and lots of really subtle things that go on. And those 3 cases, they're 3 different outcomes from what you expect. And we thought, well, why are we trying to write down some text that we can show to the customer that we can also run through Gherkin and compile and check that the system does actually work? Why don't we do something different? Why don't we write something that produces something that goes to the customer instead? So we did. We wrote our spec, and we wrote it using just code, just plain code. And that's much more flexible because we've got loops, we've got variables, we've got functions, we've got abstractions, we've got all sorts of wonderful design things that people have spent 40, 50, 60 years developing. And we didn't have to worry about designing the language as we write it. So when you're writing Gherkin-like specs, you're worried about how are you going to separate out the bits of the sentence in the way that you want to. And we didn't have to worry about that. That's already been done for us because we're writing code. And it also gave us a load of flexibility to produce weird outputs. So bits of it are text, so we can produce bits of text. Bits of it are tables, so we can produce tables. And bits of it are diagrams. And we actually produce some of these diagrams as well. The way we did these diagrams, we made some XML language. Now, there's no way that you'd show this to a customer. But it's actually really easy to write this. As a developer who knows a bit about trains, I can write this kind of thing, and it's easy to check that it kind of conforms to all of the things that tests are supposed to do. And you can kind of see what's going on here. And this bit at the bottom, these are assertions. So we were actually running this. We wrote a little interpreter that ran this kind of thing and said, does the system do the thing we want to do? But we also turned it into pictures. So we were sending this kind of thing to the customer saying, here's an explanation of what's going on. Blimey. So, my conclusion is BDD says this, roughly speaking. Dan North will probably shoot me for saying this, but writing executable specs that your customers can accept is really, really powerful. But don't try and write the specs exactly as you want the customer to see them. Instead, think about how you can collaborate with the customer and maybe write some code, maybe produce some output that's going to be a more powerful collaboration experience. I could probably do questions. No? Thank you.